At the turn of the 20th century, Winnipeg was not only the third largest city in Canada, but the wealthiest, and believe it or not, actually had more millionaires than New York City. And it was because all rail traffic in Canada had to go through Winnipeg. And 1903 would see Canada's newly elected Liberal Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier pushing for more competition for the Canadian Pacific, and Grand Trunk Railway GM Charles Melville Hayes and his risk-taking nature made him the perfect candidate for the job. The government would fund a second transcontinental railway from Moncton, New Brunswick into Winnipeg, and then the newly formed Grand Trunk Pacific would forge the route west into the Rockies and Jasper, en route for the Pacific coast in Prince Rupert, with this 4,800 miles of track stretching coast to coast, and they would make it into Winnipeg in 1906. They would break ground on a new station in 1909 in collaboration with the Canadian Northern Railway, which is why the station is called Union Station, as it was a union of the railways, and that would open in 1911. But Hayes had envisioned a chain of hotels along his route with a signature look that the history books would not forget. And he started in Ottawa in 1909 with the construction of the Chateau Laurier, which would open in 1912, which I'll have a separate video coming up in this series. But on August 14th, 1910, Hayes would announce plans to construct a brand new hotel in Winnipeg. The hotel would be named the Selkirk Hotel, named in honor of the Selkirk settlers who settled the land a century earlier, and Hayes had envisioned a hotel that would steal the spotlight from the Canadian Pacific and the Royal Alexandra in every way, with land stretching all the way back to the river on Assiniboine Avenue, in case an expansion was ever needed for the hotel. And this hotel would be composed of Indiana limestone, carved with decorative stonework, and a signature steep pitch copper roof. Her imposing mass and clean design towering above the prairies that surround it, the hotel's bold silhouette on the horizon must have really been a real treat back in the day to see in person. And without a question, an architectural masterpiece, and actually designed by the same builders of Grand Central Station in New York City, Maple Leaf Gardens, home of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the Royal York in Toronto. But a year away from the grand opening, the Grand Trunk Pacific bubble would burst, because in April of 1912, their visionary Charles Melville Hayes was traveling back from Europe to attend the grand opening of the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, and would travel across the Atlantic on the Titanic. And although his wife and children would survive the sinking, Hayes would perish in the North Atlantic that night at 2 a.m. on April 15th of 1912, along with 1,500 others. Hayes would never see the completion of his coast-to-coast railway or any of his railway hotels, including here in Winnipeg, but it is rumored that his ghost has lived here ever since the night the ship sunk. But 1 year later, Grand Trunk Pacific would opt to change the name of the hotel from the Selkirk to the Fort Garry, named in honor of the Fort Garry settlement that the hotel was built beside, and on December 10th of 1913, the hotel would open its doors. And despite being spread thin without their visionary, the Grand Trunk Pacific would complete their transcontinental route 5 months later when they drove home the final spike in Fort Fraser, BC, about 150 kilometers west of Prince George, in April of 1914. And they had even broken ground on the Hotel Macdonald in Edmonton, Chateau Coupel in Regina, Chateau Myatt in Jasper, Chateau Mount Robson, Chateau Prince George, and the king of them all, the Chateau Prince Rupert. But when World War I broke out the following year, it brought all rail travel to a halt, and although they would complete the Hotel Macdonald in Edmonton the following year in July of 1915, the rest would never see completion, and 1920 would see them fall into bankruptcy and be absorbed into the new government-operated Canadian National Railways. Now, following World War I, new Canadian National President Henry Thornton, this guy right here, was a little bit of a nut. He thought that radio was going to be the future, and he founded Canadian National Radio in 1923, and all CN hotels, including the Fort Garry, would have a broadcast headquarters on the top floor, and CN already had a network of telegraph wires running along the route for rail traffic control. And these radio waves would provide entertainment for all Canadian National passenger trains from Vancouver to Halifax, and they even broadcasted the first NHL game between the Leafs and Blackhawks here at the Fort Garry Hotel in 1931. Now, the decades that followed were, like I mentioned earlier, a bit of a downtime for rail travel, and the peak of that was in February of 1979, when Canadian National would announce plans to close the Fort Garry Hotel and soon demolish it once they had built a brand new hotel down the street. But due to immediate backlash from locals, within days, CN had walked back those promises and announced that the hotel would be sold privately instead for $100,000 to this guy, John Perrin. Now, John owned the hotel for a decade, but despite purchasing the hotel for $100,000, a few years later he was assessed a tax bill for $2.85 million by the city. And despite multiple appeals being denied, he did really the only thing you could at that point, which was apply for a permit to demolish the hotel in hopes that the city would reassess his taxes seriously instead of dismissing them. But it kind of backfired because the city would instead seize the hotel from him and end up selling off all the adjacent land behind the hotel to a private developer and construct a new $65 million apartment complex that you can still see here today, blocking the beautiful views of the garden and the river for the guests and kill any plans for a future expansion. And 1990 would see the hotel sold one final time to today's owners, but the city of Winnipeg would actually end up acknowledging last year in 2024 that John was incorrectly assessed. Instead of $2.85 million in taxes, the proper amount was $280,000, confirming that the hotel was wrongfully seized. And although it may not have ever fully expanded back to the river, the peaceful views of the river and the gardens below would still exist instead of the, well, let's call it for what it is, the absolute eyesore burying it in the skyline above. And fast forward to today, that brings us to my experience here in 2025 inside Winnipeg's final and only remaining Grand Railway Hotel.